Orchestrated original story with new characters, plot mechanics, and narrative voice. Orchestrated original story with new characters, plot mechanics, and narrative voice. The wine was still warm in my throat when my legs stopped answering me. I remember thinking it was the long drive, the 4 hours from the airport with the heat blasting and my eyes burning, and then the funeral, and then the reception, where I'd shaken 60 hands belonging to people I half recognized. I remember telling myself a body can only take so much before it folds. So when I sat down on the edge of the guest bed in my father's house and felt the floor tilt sideways, I blamed the wine and the grief and the exhaustion, in that order, and I lay back against the pillow that smelled like a stranger's laundry detergent. Then I tried to lift my hand to my face and my hand wouldn't come. It's a strange thing, the moment your body becomes a room you're locked out of. I could feel everything, the cool cotton under my cheek, a draft from the window someone had cracked, my own heartbeat, which had started to go very fast, but the parts of me that were supposed to do something about all that had gone quiet, like a phone on the other side of a wall ringing for someone who wasn't home. The hallway light came on under the door. I heard the floorboards before I heard the voices. That particular groan the third board from the top of the stairs has made my whole life. Footsteps. 2 sets, careful. The door eased open a few inches and stopped there, and nobody turned on the lamp, and that was the detail that finally made the fear real. People who mean you well turned on the lamp. "She's down," my stepmother said. Her voice was low and even, the way she talked on the phone to people she wanted something from. "Took longer than you said it would." "She's bigger than the dose was built for," a man's voice. "I didn't know it. Give it a minute." The mattress dipped near my hip. Fingers found the inside of my wrist, pressing for a pulse. Businesslike, the way you check a melon at the store. I lay there staring at the ceiling I couldn't turn away from, and I counted the water stain in the corner that had been there since I was 9, and I prayed to a God I'd mostly stopped talking to, that whoever this man was, he was a doctor, that someone had called for help, that I was wrong about the lamp. "Heartbeat strong," the man said. "Too strong. She's not as far under as you want her." "Cheap doesn't have to be all the way under," my stepmother said. "She just has to be the kind of out that looks like a person who took too much of her own pills. That's the whole point. We're not." She stopped, lowered her voice further, but I caught it. "Keep it clean. No marks, nothing that photographs. The hearing's Thursday. After that, none of this matters." The hearing. I have spent my whole adult life with numbers, and the thing about numbers is they don't comfort you and they don't lie to you, and somewhere in the fog that word landed in me like a cold coin dropped in deep water. And everything I'd been telling myself for 2 days reorganized itself into something I could finally read. This wasn't grief making me clumsy, this wasn't too much wine, this was a plan. And the plan had a date, and the date was 4 days away, and I was supposed to be a particular shape by then. Unsteady, unreliable. The kind of woman whose own family had no choice but to step in. "This part doesn't sit right with me," the man said. "You're being paid not to have a stomach," my stepmother said. "Go wait downstairs, I'll handle the rest." The door clicked shut. The hallway light went out under it, and in the dark, I did the only thing left to me, which was to keep breathing slow and shallow and to keep my eyes shut and to listen to the man's footsteps go down the stairs and stop and start again and stop, like he couldn't decide which way to walk. My name is Marin. I was 31 years old the night my stepmother poisoned my wine, and I'd flown in that morning to bury the only parent I had left. I should explain the shape of us because the shape is the whole story. My mother died when I was 19. Pancreatic, fast. The kind of fast that doesn't give you time to say the things you'd been saving. She was the warm one. She kept a junk drawer full of expired coupons and rubber bands and one good pocket knife, and she'd let me sit on the counter while she cooked and tell her everything, even the boring parts, especially the boring parts. After she was gone, the house got quiet in a way that never really lifted. My father remarried 14 months later. I was away at school by then, studying accounting because I was good at it and because it felt like the opposite of grief. All that order, all those columns that had to agree with each other before you were allowed to close the book. My new stepmother arrived with a son a few years older than me, and the two of them slid into the empty house and the empty chairs and the empty side of the bed, and my father, who had never been a hard man so much as a tired one, let them. I won't pretend I fought for my place. I didn't. I made myself small and far away. I built a life in Colorado, in a town up against the foothills where the air is thin and clean and nobody knew me as somebody's leftover daughter. I worked as a forensic accountant, which is a fancy way of saying companies and law firms paid me to find the lie inside the spreadsheet. People think it's tedious. I think it's the closest thing to justice I've ever been able to hold in my two hands. Money doesn't have feelings. It doesn't take sides. It just goes where someone sends it, and if you're patient and you don't blink, it'll tell you who. I came home twice a year and left early both times. So I didn't see it building. That's the part I'll carry. The phone calls from my father that got shorter and stranger over the last year. The way he'd ask me things he already knew the answer to, like he was reading from a card. The Christmas where my stepbrother kept steering the talk toward money, toward the trust my mother had left me, the one that came to me clean when I turned 32. No strings. Her way of making sure her death paid for at least one good thing in my life. I'd answered his questions and thought nothing of it. People ask about money the way they ask about the weather. What I know now, what I didn't know then, is that for the better part of a year my stepmother and my stepbrother had been quietly assembling a version of me that didn't exist. A woman who forgot to pay her bills, who'd been seen confused at family gatherings, who'd made worrying calls in the middle of the night. There were emails I never sent, a voicemail spliced. A statement from a credit card I'd never opened in my name from an address that was my father's house. They were building a paper trail toward a courtroom, and the trail's whole purpose was to arrive at one conclusion, that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own affairs, and that someone responsible should be appointed to do it for me. Someone like family. Someone who, the moment that order was signed, would have their hands on every dollar my mother died to leave me. My father's death moved the timeline up. I understand that now too. A man with a conscience, even a tired one, is a problem for a plan like theirs. Whether he knew the whole of it or only enough to lose sleep, I'll never get to ask. He had a heart attack in his own kitchen on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, my stepmother had already filed a petition, and by the following week, she was burying him with my name on a court calendar. She was sure I'd be too foggy to read. But I'm getting ahead. Let me go back to the dark room, because that's where the woman I'd been turned into, the woman who walked into that courthouse. I lay still for what felt like hours and was probably 40 minutes. The drug came off me the way frost comes off a windshield, slow, then all at once. First my fingers, a pins and needles burn I welcomed like a friend. Then my forearms. I flexed my hands under the blanket where no one could see and I waited. And somewhere in the house a television murmured, and I heard my stepbrother's laugh. Easy and bright. The laugh of a man whose biggest worry that night was whether the timing would hold. When I could move my legs again, I didn't run. Running was the old me, the small, faraway me. I rolled onto my side, quietly, and that's when I saw it. Half under the nightstand where it had fallen or been dropped, a thin plastic card on a blue cord. A lanyard. The kind hospital staff wear. I reached down with an arm that still felt like it belonged to someone else, and I closed my fingers around it and brought it up to my face in the streetlight coming through the cracked window. A name I didn't recognize, a photo of a man with a tired, decent face, and underneath, the logo of a private agency, one of those companies that supply wellness companions and patient observers, the kind of people you hire when you want a medical witness who'll write down whatever you need them to have seen. He'd left it. I was sure of it the moment I held it. A man waiting downstairs who couldn't decide which way to walk had taken off his lanyard and let it fall where the woman he was being paid to help erase would find it. That's the closest thing to a guardian angel I've ever met, and I never learned his real face beyond that photo, and I think about him more than I think about almost anyone else from that year. I got dressed in the dark. I have never in my life been so careful with a zipper. I put the lanyard in my coat pocket and my shoes in my hand, and I went down the back stairs, the ones off the kitchen that my stepmother probably didn't even remember existed, and I let myself out the side door into a cold that hit me like a slap and felt like the best thing I'd ever breathed. I didn't stop walking until I reached my rental car at the end of the block, where I'd left it because the driveway had been full of mourners' cars. I sat behind the wheel with the doors locked and my hands shaking too hard to fit the key, and I made myself wait, and when I could finally drive, I drove 40 minutes to a hospital, 2 towns over where nobody knew my family's name. I want to be very clear about what I did next because for a long time afterward, people asked me why, and I think the why is the whole point. I walked into that emergency room at 1 in the morning and I told the triage nurse that I believed I had been drugged and that I needed it documented and that I needed my blood drawn before whatever it was metabolized out of me. I said the word documented twice. I was a forensic accountant. I knew that the difference between a story and a case is whether you can prove it, and I knew that a thing that isn't measured might as well not have happened. They were kind. They were thorough. A doctor with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair listened to me without that flicker of doubt I'd braced for, and she ordered a full toxicology panel, and she wrote down the time I said I'd had the wine and the time my body stopped answering me. And she had a security officer take a photograph of the lanyard before I'd even thought to ask. Hours later, the panel came back, and it found a sedative in my blood at a level no one prescribes for sleep, in a body that takes no medication and never had. I didn't cry in the hospital. I cried in the parking lot afterward, sitting in the rental with the heater roaring, holding the printout the doctor had let me keep. I cried because it was real, and because it was proof, and because for the first time since I was 19 years old, I had something in my hands that no one in that family could call hysterical or confused or jealous. I had a number, and the number agreed with me. The lawyer I found was named Naomi Cardell, and she didn't waste a single minute trying to make me feel better, which is exactly why I trusted her. I got her name from a hotline at 3 in the morning, and I called her office the second it opened, and her assistant heard the word competency and the word toxicology in the same breath and put me through. Naomi listened for 11 minutes without interrupting. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard while I sat in the hospital lot, too wired to drive anywhere else. When I finished, she was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I need you to come in today, and I need you to bring everything, and I need you to not go back to that house." And the flat certainty in her voice was the second best thing I'd felt all night. What my stepmother had filed, Naomi explained, sliding a copy of it across her desk that afternoon, was a petition to have me declared legally incapacitated. If a judge granted it, my stepmother would be named my conservator. She would control my finances. She would control where I lived. She would control the trust, all of it, with a court's blessing and a court's protection, and undoing it would take years and money I'd no longer be allowed to touch. On what basis? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Naomi turned the pages so I could see them. Cognitive decline, erratic financial behavior, a pattern of episodes. She tapped a line. They've got a statement here from a home wellness aide who was, quote, present during an incident the night of the funeral. Says he observed you incoherent and unresponsive and unable to be roused. I took the lanyard out of my pocket and set it on her desk, on top of the page, right over the place where the aide's statement was supposed to live. Naomi looked at it for a long moment. Is that him? I think he had second thoughts, I said. I think he left it on purpose. She picked it up and turned it over, and something in her jaw changed, a small hardening I'd come to recognize as the look she got when she found the thread she could pull. This isn't just a fraudulent petition, she said. If you were sedated without your knowledge to manufacture the very incident they're submitting as evidence, that's not a family dispute. That's a crime, and it's a crime with a paper trail, and I do this for a living because I love a paper trail. She set the lanyard down. The hearing's Thursday. That's not enough time for them. It's plenty for us. I want to tell you about the box, because the box is the part that still undoes me. When my mother was dying, she gave me a key on a length of green ribbon and told me it opened a safe deposit box at a bank back in our hometown, and she told me not to open it until I felt entirely on my own in the world. I was 19 and I didn't understand what she meant. And I tied the ribbon to the zipper pull inside my coat, where I'd see it and forget it for 12 years. I'd moved that ribbon from coat to coat without ever once driving to the bank. I think some part of me believed that as long as I didn't open it, there was still something of her I hadn't used up. I felt entirely on my own in the world the Wednesday before the hearing, so I drove to the bank. Inside the box, under the lid, was an envelope in her handwriting, and under the envelope was a folder of documents, and I sat in the little private room the bank gives you for these things, and I read my mother's letter with my hand pressed flat against my mouth. She had known. Not the specifics, not the wine, not the lanyard, but the shape of it. She wrote that she'd watched the family she married into and that she did not trust where her death would leave me. She wrote that she'd made the trust airtight, that she'd had a separate attorney structure it so that no one could touch it before I turned 32, and no court could reassign it on a claim of incapacity without that attorney being notified, a tripwire she'd built in on purpose. She wrote a sentence I have memorized, that if anyone ever tried to tell the world I was unwell in order to take what was mine, I should know that she had seen me clearly to the end and that I was the most steady-handed person she'd ever raised. And the folder underneath held the original trust documents, the real ones, the ones that made the version my stepmother had been quietly editing for a year fall apart the moment you laid them side by side. My mother had reached forward 12 years to put her thumb on the scale for me. I am not a person who believes in much, but I believe in that. I called Naomi from the car. I read her the relevant lines while I cried and steered with one hand, and when I was done she was quiet again, the way she got, and then she said, "Okay," very softly, "Okay, now we're going to win," and I believed her. Thursday morning I wore my mother's coat. It still had the green ribbon tied inside the zipper, empty now, the key in my pocket. I walked into a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old paper, and I saw my stepmother already seated at the front in a charcoal dress, composed, hands folded, every inch the concerned family member. My stepbrother sat beside her in a suit, scrolling his phone like a man waiting for a flight. Neither of them stood when I came in. My stepmother turned her head just enough to find me and gave me a look I'd been getting since I was 20 years old, a look that said, "You poor confused thing," and for the first time in my life it didn't make me smaller. It made me very, very calm. Her attorney went first, and he was good, I'll give him that. He talked about love. He talked about a family that had watched a fragile young woman struggle since the loss of her mother, and now her father, and how painful it was for everyone. How the petition was an act of protection, not control. He submitted his documents, the curated ones, the emails I'd never sent, and the statement from a wellness aide who, conveniently, could not be reached to testify in person. He spoke for 20 minutes and he made me sound like a tragedy with my own name on it. Then Naomi stood and she did not raise her voice once. She started with the small things, because that's how you take a lie apart, from the corners in. The credit card statement listing an address that was not mine. The email metadata that placed the supposedly unsent messages on a device that had never been in my possession. The voicemail, run through an analyst who'd flagged it as spliced from 3 separate calls. She laid each one down like a card, unhurried, and I watched the judge's pen start moving faster. Then she submitted the toxicology report. She read the sedative's name and the level found in my blood and the time of the draw, and she set beside it the wellness aide's written statement claiming he'd observed me unresponsive that same night, and she let the room sit with the arithmetic for a moment. A woman who takes no medication, a sedative at a level no doctor prescribes, an aide hired by the petitioner, present in the home on the very night the petitioner's evidence said an incident occurred. "Your Honor," Naomi said, "my client wasn't experiencing an episode. My client was drugged, in her sleep, by the people asking you to put them in charge of her life, in order to create the episode they then submitted to this court." And she placed the lanyard on the evidence table, in its clear plastic sleeve. The tired, decent face of a man who couldn't decide which way to walk staring up at the ceiling. My stepmother's composure cracked for exactly 1 second. I was watching for it. The fold of her hands tightened and her chin came up, and she shot a look at her attorney that wasn't concern, that wasn't grief, that was the pure animal calculation of a person realizing the ground has moved. Then Naomi submitted my mother's trust documents and the tripwire built into them and called the outside attorney my mother had named 12 years ago, who confirmed by sworn statement that he had received no notification of any conservatorship action as the trust required, because the people filing it had never known he existed. The judge asked me to speak. I thought I'd be terrified. I wasn't. I answered every question she put to me about my work, my finances, my own life. And I answered them in the language I've spoken fluently since I was 22, the clean, exact language of someone who balances books for a living. And I watched the court-appointed evaluator's face go from neutral to confused to something close to angry, not at me. I have to ask, the evaluator said finally, half to the room, why this petition was filed at all. Nobody answered. Nobody had to. The judge dismissed the petition from the bench. She did it in a flat-clipped voice that left no room in it. And then she did the thing I hadn't dared hope for. She ordered an investigation into how the petition had been brought, and into the toxicology finding, and into the firm that had supplied the wellness aid. My stepmother stood up too fast and started to say there had been a terrible misunderstanding, and the judge told her to sit down in a tone I've only ever heard one other time from my mother, and only once. It didn't end in that courtroom. These things never do. The investigation took months, and months are long when you're living inside them. The detective assigned to it was a patient woman named Salas, who reminded me a little of myself, the way she'd go quiet and let the silence do her interviewing for her. She traced the sedative to a prescription in my stepbrother's name, filled at a pharmacy 2 towns over. She found the wire transfers that paid the wellness agency, and the agency, eager not to drown alongside their clients, handed over the aide, who turned out to be exactly the man on the lanyard, and who told the truth in full. He said he'd been told it was a welfare check on a woman with a substance problem. He said when he understood what he'd actually walked into, he'd left his ID where he hoped she'd find it, because he didn't have the courage to do more and couldn't live with doing less. I never got to thank him. I hope someone read him my statement. The forged documents traced back, every single one, to my stepmother and my stepbrother, working together, the way they'd done everything in that house since they walked into it. Everything they'd accused me of, the hidden money, the secret accounts, the financial chaos, they've been doing themselves, draining my father's accounts for a year, which is part of why they needed mine. People who lie about you are very often just describing themselves and changing the name. My stepmother was charged. So was my stepbrother. The trial was its own long winter, and I won't walk you through all of it, except to say that she never once looked at me across that room, not when the evidence came in, not when the verdict was read, not when the sentence came down, which was a long one, long enough to make clear that a court had decided what I already knew, that this was not a misunderstanding, but a thing done on purpose, with a date on the calendar, to a person they decided didn't count. My stepbrother got less. His lawyer painted him as a follower, a weak man steered by a stronger one, and there was enough truth in it that the judge believed it. He got time and he got probation and he got, I'm told, a kind of breakdown afterward, the collapse of a man who'd borrowed all his certainty from someone who was no longer there to lend it. He sent me a letter once from inside. I didn't open it. I'd learned the year before how dangerous it can be to drink something someone hands you when they say it'll help. I expected to feel triumphant when it was over. I want to be honest with you, because I think you came here for honesty and not for a tidy ending. I didn't feel triumphant. I stood on the courthouse steps the day it ended, in my mother's coat, in a cold, bright wind, and what I felt was steady. Not high, not vindicated, just level, like a foundation that's finally been poured on ground that won't shift. I'd spent my whole life believing that the way to be safe was to be small, to be quiet, to be far away and easy to overlook. And the thing that nearly killed me, the thing that almost worked, was that being overlooked is exactly what makes you easy to erase. I went back to Colorado. I came into my mother's trust on my 32nd birthday, clean, the way she'd fought from the far side of death to make sure I would, and I used part of it to buy a small house at the edge of a town where I knew no one, with a porch that faces the mountains, and I sleep there now with the door unlocked, which is a thing I never thought I'd be able to do again. Sometimes late, I think about the lamp, how no one turned it on, how that one small detail told me everything before my mind was willing to know it, and I think about the man who couldn't decide which way to walk and chose, in the end, to drop a card on the floor where a drugged woman might find it. We don't always get to be brave. Sometimes the most we manage is to leave a door open a crack for someone else to get out, and that turns out to be enough. If you've ever been the one they decided didn't count, the one who was told you were confused or unstable or ungrateful, right at the moment you were seeing things most clearly, I need you to hear the thing it took me 31 years and a poisoned glass of wine to learn. Being quiet was never the same as being safe. You are allowed to be the one who notices. You are allowed to keep the proof. And you are allowed to walk into the room they were sure you'd be too foggy to find and set it down on the table and let the truth do what the truth does. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments about the moment you stopped making yourself small, and follow along because next time I'll tell you what happened the day my stepmother's letter finally arrived and what I decided to do with it. The lamp is the thing I keep coming back to. Nobody turned it on. People who mean you well turn on the lamp, and the dark over my bed that night was the first true thing anyone in that house had told me in years. I had spent my whole life believing the way to stay safe was to stay small, to live 4 hours and 1 mountain range away, to make myself so easy to overlook that no one would bother to do me harm. What I learned, lying frozen with my own pulse racing, is that being overlooked is exactly what makes a person easy to erase. The plan almost worked because they were sure I'd never see it. The plan fell apart because, for once, I refused to look away. I think about cause and effect the way I think about a ledger now, because that's the work I do. Every number lands somewhere. My stepmother chose to forge, and the forgery left metadata. My stepbrother chose to fill a prescription in his own name, and the pharmacy kept the record. They built a lie out of paper, and paper remembers. The night came down to a single choice I made in a dark room, not to run but to drive to a hospital and ask for my blood to be drawn and the time written down. I didn't feel brave doing it. I felt terrified and clear at the same time, and I've come to think that's what doing the right thing usually feels like. Not a swelling of courage, but a quiet refusal to let a wrong go unrecorded. There were 3 things that carried me, and I didn't have them in equal measure when I started. The first was the plain decision to do what's honest even when it would have been easier to stay quiet, the way the stranger did when he dropped his lanyard on the floor instead of finishing what he was paid for. The second was the patience to gather proof and let the truth assemble itself instead of screaming my innocence into a room that had already decided I was unwell. My mother gave me that 12 years early when she built a tripwire into her trust and trusted me to be steady enough to find it. The third was the sheer stubbornness to walk into that courtroom in her coat and stay standing when every instinct I'd trained since I was 19 told me to shrink. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. You can be a decent person and still keep the receipts. You can forgive what was done to you and still let it be measured by a court that doesn't traffic in feelings. Naomi told me the difference between a story and a case is whether you can prove it, and the difference between a victim and a survivor is whether you're willing to. The people who told me I was confused were describing themselves. The mother who saw me clearly was right, and the woman who finally turned the lamp on was me.